Welcome everybody. Thanks so much. This is our Monday, August 25th, local teams and speaker series. Thanks so much for everybody for joining us. Really happy to have everybody here. Very excited to welcome a special guest, Tony Jordan. So just tonight we'll be hearing a talk from Tony, and then after that, I'll give a little recap on kind of local news around the bike pedestrian space around Marin. After Tony speaks, we'll have a little Q&A. After we let him go, I'll give a little recap, and then we can open up some breakout rooms for people to chat based on their location. So really excited to welcome Tony Jordan. So just a little recap, in the discussion over urban transportation and politics, parking, which is, a word some people find very boring or frustrating, has increasingly become a part of the discussion, really previously overlooked in the planning space until a UCLA economist named Donald Shoup wrote a 800-page book about it, a book that actually kind of inspired me to start on this current career. Reformers point out that parking takes up an incredible amount of land in our cities. In some urban spaces, nearly half of the developable land. So I want to welcome tonight our guest, Tony Jordan, president of the Parking Reform Network. PRN was formed, I'm sure Tony can speak about this more fluently than I can, but it was formed to advocate for a reduction and repeal of these policies that have huge effects on housing, transportation, and livability. And speaking as someone who, about our work in bike advocacy, whether or not a project is going to reduce parking and how much is sometimes the only matter that elected officials care about. I think we've had a couple of those people who've been following our work in Sausalito and Novato this year may nod along to that. So tonight, Tony is going to share information about his organization's critical work across the United States and beyond, and how parking reform here in Marin can benefit people walking and biking. So without further ado, I'd love to pass it over to Tony. Tony, thank you so much for joining us. Please feel free to give your presentation, and we'll hold questions to the end, and afterward we'll open up for Q&A. And if so I'll pass it over.
Great, thanks. Hello everyone, thanks for having me here. I'm Tony Jordan. I live in Portland, Oregon. I grew up in Los Angeles and went to school in Santa Cruz, so I've got a California connection of sorts. I'm here to talk to you about parking. Title of this, Parking Problems, How to Solve Them. It could be anything. The presentation here is, hopefully it'll be useful for you in a couple ways. If you're not familiar with the material or the concepts around why parking requirements and the way we deal with parking in our cities is bad, this will help you, hopefully convince you that it's a problem. I also, for advocates, I think that this presentation is useful for modeling some of the way we think talking about parking is good. Some examples, I've tailored some to your local communities, and just so hopefully it's useful and somewhat entertaining. So I'm going to get going. As mentioned, I'm from the Parking Reform Network. I founded this organization about 6 years ago. We're a nonprofit with international members, largely national scope. We work with advocacy organizations and advocates all around the country who want to reduce the amount of parking that's required by their cities and advocate for better on-street management. We do this. We have data products. We give presentations like this. We just convene people together who catch the parking bug. So that's who we are. As mentioned, here to talk about the parking problem. If you ask an average person, what is the parking problem? They're probably going to tell you that there's not enough parking or it's too expensive. And in my opinion, and I think an increasing number of folks' opinion, it's the opposite. We've got too much parking in our cities and it's underpriced and not efficiently used. And this has led over the years to higher costs of rent, just more sprawl, higher costs of pretty much everything, and increased dependency on driving all over the place. We know there's too much parking because we've surveyed cities around the country. PRN has a map, that QR code would take you there, where we've looked at about 100 US cities, just the downtown cores, and looked at how much of the developable land is taken up by parking lots or parking garages. And it's like in the mid 20% average. Some places are more like 40%. A few cities that were built largely before the automobile and had good transit service are much less. And these downtown areas are sometimes are often the best case scenario. A more modern shopping center is going to be a much higher percentage of parking, maybe 60, 70%, if you look at that area. All that parking, when you now I can't really look at it anymore as anything but about a lot of money and the ghost of kind of what was there before and the promise though of what could be there in the past. So it's not all. I mean, the promise of what could be there in the future, I should say. It's not all bad, but when you think about this amount of space and every one of those spaces costing a lot of money and taking up valuable real estate, it's a problem. So, the original sin here, how we got in this situation, is largely these things called parking mandates, parking requirements, parking ratios. These ratios came from, these are in your zoning code for almost every city. There's a table that says how much parking you need for every kind of business. And these were made up in the 1950s and 60s when people were just building. But when the cars came in, before there was a lot of zoning regulation, developers and their architects and the planners would kind of just decide how much parking to build. And as you can see, this planning advisory service from 1954, they would guess a number of stalls and either it was too many or not enough. Then those surveys or the guesses that people made were written into law, and it's very different everywhere. So I'm going to show you if you want to build a bowling alley. I did have to pull in a couple other cities to get a spread like this, but if you want to build a bowling alley in Northern California, the north of the Bay Area, you might need 2 spaces per lane in Rohnert Park. You might need, I know Folsom's a little bit far away, 6 per lane in Folsom. I didn't do a comprehensive survey, but you could see San Rafael, 4 per lane, Corte Madera, 5 per lane, Yuba City, 3 per lane. And so the question is like, what is the difference? What could be responsible for a spread in this case of just 3 times between Rohnert Park and Folsom? And I've seen a larger spread of 4 times or more on this. Something just for, Marin County, cities in Marin County, if you want to open a bank, there's a spread between 1 per 180 square feet to 1 per 400 square feet. Once again, why would bank in Mill Valley need twice as much parking as one in Tiburon? It doesn't make sense, and that's the point. You even have parking requirements in Sausalito and Tiburon that are for, is it Tiburon? Am I saying that right? I don't know. Okay. For parking itself,
Perfect.
vehicle storage, 1 per 300 square feet of office space, and employee parking requirement for a parking requirement for employee parking. I don't really know what these mean. At this point, you might be thinking these could be made by tarot cards, throwing darts at a wall, and it's kind of true, except this is like, it does express itself in real sprawl and real problems in our city. I got just a couple more of these because I think it's really important to drive home how ridiculous these are. I'll stop picking on the region. I've seen parking requirements, such as in Gilbert, Arizona, for a haunted house, 1 per 100 square feet. And this one in Carver, Massachusetts, for a cemetery where it's 1 per 8 occupants. Like these are bonkers. They're all over the country. You can go find examples. The last one here is this tiny little town in Georgia that has very specific parking requirements. Donald Shute would have said they're roughly right or precisely wrong. 0.72 per employee at a hospital, 0.26 per student. And this tiny town, which I've looked at it, it's mostly a cemetery, in fact, has 2 different land uses for helicopter parking, a heliport and a helistop. And what is the difference? Hell if I know, is the joke there. It's funny, but it's not a laughing matter. This is the DNA of our cities. It leads to places that are theoretically easy to get to if you drive, but they're not places you want to be, right? They're hot, they're noisy, they're uncomfortable, they're difficult to walk back and forth from. Parking, so it's got form issues in how our cities build, but there's inherent intrinsic costs and problems with parking as well. Too much of it. It costs a lot. So a parking space, these numbers may vary. These are just kind of, there are spaces that cost these amount for sure, more and less depending. Surface parking space costs about $5,000 to $10,000 per stall, not including land. Above ground parking spaces, $40,000, $50,000, $60,000 is not uncommon. Below ground, just kind of double the cost of an above ground parking space. This is real money. $1,000 in construction costs is about $10 a month in rent. So a $40,000 parking space is $400 in rent or in increased costs. Somebody has to pay, right? These are real dollars. And, it's often said, budgets are a moral document. I think it's really important to think about this in real terms of how we spend our money and how we require our money to be spent in our cities and how that reflects our values. So in Stamford, Connecticut, there's just this example of a park and ride station they built by the train that cost $90 million and parks about 1,000 cars. So this is $88,000 per car. That includes this walkway, which a lot of times some of the best pedestrian infrastructure in cities is actually how to get to a parking garage. It's a tunnel or a bridge, but still $88,000 to park a car. And in the same city, there's a low income, permanently affordable housing structure, deeply affordable, called the Franklin Apartments, that was built for $9 million of $9 million of investment. It requires no ongoing subsidy, and it houses between 100 and 120 people. So we can house people cheaper than we can park cars, and we choose to require these expensive costs to park cars instead of housing people. Parking takes up a lot of space. A parking space is 300 to 400 square feet. So an average parking requirement of 1.5 to 2 spaces per apartment often can easily take up the same space of the apartment itself. So we require more parking, more space for storing cars than we do allow homes for people to live in. And when we look at actually like renter households in particular, this is in Marin County, according to the census, you have actually, everyone says that their city is car dependent. Everyone says that everyone needs cars, but in every city, there are people who aren't driving or don't. And households in Marin County, renter households, looks like about 56% of them own one car or no car. Now, certainly the number of no vehicle households is only 10%, but the number of households that only have one vehicle is a majority of renter households, and that could be single parents, single folks on their own. So they're paying a parking tax. And so here's some of your parking requirements for multifamily housing in the county. 2.2 per 2-bedroom unit. I just pulled the 2-bedroom units here because thinking if you're a single parent with a child, or even just, a couple with a child, you want to have a separate bedroom for your kid, you're paying a parking tax, right? You're paying a 1.5 to a 1.2. That asterisk is because that 0.2 in San Rafael is for guest parking, which is pretty common. It's just a multiplier. So we're over parking and making people pay a parking tax. I want to point out, if you've not seen this book, when we think about who the non-drivers are, because very often, when you have this discussion, people tell you that, this area is not appropriate for low parking buildings. I guarantee you, in every part of your community, every part of the county, there are people living right now who can't drive, and they're stuck there often if it is truly a car dependent place. These are people with disabilities, people because of age, either too old or too young, they can't drive, people with legal issues or monetary issues, or just people who don't want to drive. And these parking requirements and the way that we accommodate cars makes it impossible to build homes or businesses that can serve these communities better. And so that's what we're trying to fix. So what does this do, right? Just as how to go back to kind of like the form of the cities, the higher the parking requirement, the more sprawl everything has to be. So one big effect of having a high parking requirement is that, you can't build things close together. And the higher the parking requirement, often, the parking lot is going to be bigger than the building itself. So if we want to have compact and walkable places that are human scale, that are more affordable, we have to reduce or eliminate these requirements. Just some examples of how this really ends up looking in reality. These are some screenshots I took today. These are the same size. So both of these are taking up the same area. And, a nice main street with tons of businesses compared to a more modern shopping center, you can just see the complete difference in how this approaches in scale and in walkability and in approachability. Pedestrian oriented versus auto oriented, to sort of move to Novato, like, a downtown with a bunch of businesses versus, a more modern shopping center. So it's very clear how these work. Not only is this a bad experience for anyone who wants to be somewhere and not be in a car, but it's also very damaging for our city's finances. So this is from Springfield, Missouri, but the same thing kind of holds true most places. I know there's a property tax distortion issue in California, but low density households, a new home, let's say that they're paying the full market rate or a more fair assessed value, is going to write a large check theoretically individually, or a Walmart is going to write a large check to the county for property taxes. But on a per acre basis, these sprawl parking forward developments don't pay very much. They take up more space though, so the services required to serve them, the electrical, the water, the roads in particular, are still required around a parking lot, but the assessed value of the parking lot is so low that it pays almost nothing. So it doesn't pay for the roads. So you're taking the property tax from buildings and using it to maintain your roads and infrastructure, because the parking lots aren't paying their fair share. Another big problem with this is there's environmental and water quality issues. This leads, this is Hartford, Connecticut, between 1960 and 2000. You've removed a lot of tax-paying buildings to build parking lots. You've also increased a lot of urban heating issues, and you've caused major runoff problems. So I know in Portland, Oregon, we don't have a subway system, but we do have something similar to the South Hartford Conveyance and Storage Tunnel, which is a $2.5 billion subway size sewage pipe, right? Which just takes water from parking lots and moves it to the water treatment plant. And these are common around the country. So there's all these additional costs that come along from overbuilding your parking. Another impact is economic development. This is my grandmother in 1960. She had 3 kids. She was a single mother trying to make ends meet. And so she had a hair salon in the basement of her home and would cut hair. If you're even allowed to do a commercial business in many cities, in San Rafael or Larkspur, she'd have to have 2 parking spaces, for this one salon chair. So like these are rules that impact business development. They impact how people can have upward economic mobility. They impact how we live out our lives. So this is an example from adult foster facility in Beaverton, Oregon, which was a 12-bedroom home, had could not house 7 patients, couldn't put patients in 7 bedrooms because of a 5-patient limit based on the parking requirement for this adult foster care facility. These are facilities where people with memory care issues, people with end of life hospice care are at. This woman, Melissa Bruce, fought with the city for years. She actually had 5 parking stalls on site if you include the garage, but sometimes the code also says what a parking space counts for. The parking spaces in her garage and the stacked parking didn't count. So she fought with the city for years, and this business closed in 2023. The next year, I believe, Beaverton got rid of its parking requirements, but it was just a little bit too late. So to recap some of this, parking is not a community benefit. If you build with more parking, your homes are going to be more expensive. There's going to be more traffic, fewer trees and green spaces, less active transportation. You build with less parking, you get kind of the opposite of those things: lower car ownership, more green space. It undermines a lot of goals that we have, right? We want to reduce traffic congestion. We want to increase bike and mode share. We want to reduce GHG and have economic vitality. The existing parking, I think this is a good argument important argument to remember, is that the existing parking supply already supports the traffic you have. So if your traffic is bad, adding parking is only going to make that traffic worse, kind of like as a guarantee. That's just a given. More parking means less housing. You have more urban runoff and urban heating, and it's a barrier to entry with poor tax performance. And just to hammer home the impact on transportation, this is the classic one more lane bro kind of argument, but more parking is more traffic is bigger roads and parking are sprawly, slower transit and other modes. So then people drive more and demand more parking, and then we get into the situation we are with our cities today. But fortunately, there is a solution to this. The good news part of this is there's the Shoup Doctrine by Professor Shoup, as Warren mentioned. The 3 steps to making better cities are to get rid of these rules, then manage your curbs, price your curbs for 85% occupancy, and then use any money you're getting from parking to reduce car dependency. And we can slowly dig our way, fill in these holes, and get back to a better situation. As far as getting rid of parking requirements, it's happening. When I started PRN, there were roughly maybe like 16 cities in the US that had gotten rid of parking mandates entirely for the whole city for all their uses. And as of now, there are at least 92 cities in the United States. And these are in red states and blue states, in places with good transit and no transit, places, Anchorage is one of these cities. It's not on this map, but places with a lot of snow, places that are hot. It's for everyone, small cities, big cities. There's also statewide reforms. You're probably familiar with some in California, like AB 2097, or the various state bills. I'm not as familiar with all of the ones that allow for more housing or other businesses to be built near transit. But the trend now is moving towards a more blanket uh, reforms. Connecticut actually passed a bill this year that would have eliminated residential parking mandates, but it was vetoed by the governor for some stupid political reasons. But Washington State and Montana both passed bills that capped residential mandates and allowed for, especially in Washington's case, sympathetic housing uses and businesses and daycares and things, eliminated those statewide in cities above 30,000. Um, there's a bill in North Carolina right now that would ban parking mandates statewide, and it's based on water quality. That was a Riverkeepers bill put forward. So there's a trend moving forward on state reforms. I know you have various state advocacy organizations that are working on this, and I'm guessing that California will keep making great progress as well. It's more than mandates, though. Cities need to mind their own business when it comes to parking. They need to stop telling developers, they need to stop telling entrepreneurs, tenants, and customers how much parking they need to provide or buy, and just work on managing their asset, the curb, right? Just pricing their curbs. If they do that, we send the right signal back to someone starting a business or building an apartment building that, well, my customers or my tenants, I can't just count on them abusing the commons or using the commons if they're over prescribed. So cities need to use parking management practices, parking meters, parking permits. Um, you want a price per performance here. You want to encourage your cities to set a price that is the lowest fair price. That's the price that leads to roughly, I mentioned this 85% occupancy number. That's roughly a space available on every block. So that means that someone driving along can find a space where they need to go. They might have to pay. Now, this is a data-driven and responsive policy. You monitor the occupancy and the usage, and you adjust the price up or down on your curbs. You don't charge for parking just for revenue purposes, because if there's not, in most places, the fact is probably in most places there's not a need to charge for parking because there's so much of it that it's useless, it's valueless practically. But this allows you to kind of manage this, and it increases turnover and access. So businesses that might be worried about this shouldn't be, because if the city's doing it properly, you're actually going to have more people able to park there over the course of a day than fewer. You do need to spend that money wisely. You don't want to just dump it in a black hole in the general fund, or have, even worse, your city get dependent on parking for revenue. You want to build better sidewalks and crosswalks, lighting, transit you can provide transit passes, bike lanes, bus shelters, etc. We have a guidebook on our website about parking benefit districts. This is a whole way to work. It's a guidebook for activists on how to approach your elected officials and community around building support for better curb management. So what happens when you get rid of parking mandates? And you do some of these things? Well, when you get rid of parking mandates, nothing happens initially. It's the same exact city as it was before. All that parking that, if it's 20% in your downtown or wherever it is, still there. If someone's got a parking space and they like to shop at Walmart or at the shopping center, they can still do that. This is not about forcing people to change the way that they live now. It's about relaxing regulations that don't make any sense and allowing for new ways to do things. What we get is a little bit more of what we want and a little bit less of at least what I don't. And I think in general we don't. We don't want expensive housing. So in cities that have done this in the past, there's been studies out of Seattle and Buffalo. Seattle didn't even get rid of parking mandates citywide. They did a transit-based thing years ago, but these have been in place long enough that they've been able to be studied. Most of the housing that's built post reforms would have been illegal under the previous regime. So that means that developers do build more homes. They still build parking, though. In a vast majority of the circumstances, they build some parking. They just build less parking. Or in some cases, some buildings still build more than's required, or more than would have been required before, but they will build parking because they have a business interest in getting tenants. And if their tenants need to drive, they're going to provide parking for them. But you can really just do a lot more in the same space. This is from Fayetteville, Arkansas. Fayetteville got rid of commercial parking mandates in their downtown years ago. So many restaurants in that piece on the right, right? In the same space, you can fit almost all of downtown Fayetteville. You can have an Olive Garden and a hibachi restaurant. And like Olive Garden's menu is pretty expansive. It's no Cheesecake Factory, but it's a big menu, but it's still the choice that we're providing. And I think that's an important thing to remember is what we're talking about is like access and abundance to things, right? We're talking about giving people options. So when we think about access, when we think about transportation, we often will hear the argument, well, we can't get rid of these parking requirements because our transit's not good enough. And I like to point out that, transit's just one way to connect people from point A to point B, ostensibly from where they live to where they want to shop or where they work. But there are other ways to get people to solve this access problem. One is center and corridor infill, right? We can allow more homes to be built near where we have some transit or near where we have services and jobs. So that's pretty common. And I want to make a pitch for suburban infill and retrofit, which is relaxing rules about siting, about where we can put some jobs and some businesses. Can we allow accessory commercial units or corner stores or other things, or even when we're when we have corridor commercial requirements, allowing those to be oriented more towards the homes that are adjacent to them as opposed to the highway or the corridor that they're on. So it's important to remember that access, people have different needs, and this is all about allowing for different choices. Parking requirements are also the key to the missing middle. I'm pretty sure in California you can't require parking for an ADU anyway, but as we move towards other things, cottage clusters and other types of housing, ADU, missing middle doesn't work with parking requirements. And as I mentioned, I just want to make a pitch for this, accessory commercial unit idea of allowing for businesses to be in neighborhoods again, right? Like this is we don't have to solve all trips, but if you can allow someone to get a haircut or go to get breakfast or something near where they live, that reduces a car trip, which kind of takes pressure off the whole system. So it's a holistic idea, but you wouldn't be able to do both of these businesses are in former garages. So if you have parking requirements, right, you can't, it doesn't work. You won't be able to do this. Wrapping up, we do have big lots, right? This is from Novato looking at San Rafael's downtown, right? Like you can fit a lot in our big parking lots that we have in our shopping centers. This is an opportunity. There are folks doing shopping center retrofit. This is an example from Duncanville, Texas. This guy, Monty Anderson from Options Real Estate, it takes these big box places, breaks up the big box commercial into smaller community focused commercial size parcels or like food courts or just, little business courts. Plans to add townhomes or other housing in there, and just you can turn an old shopping center into a new town center. So that is something that looking forward we can do. So in conclusion, you want to ultimately plan for what you want. Do you want Costco's or big Strodes, or do you want nice little the old kind of downtown that we used to allow and haven't allowed for the last I don't know 60 years or so? Parking mandates are dumb. Parking's expensive. It takes up a lot of space. We can do a lot better. Our cities will benefit. We do. And if you need help on this, you should join the Parking Reform Network. So that's my talk. I maybe went a little over here, but I'm around, so we can chat if you like. Thanks.
Tony, thank you so much. Great talk. You packed a ton in. I feel like that's a master's level course right there. Thank you so much. I want to open it up. I have some questions for you. Some genuine, not a couple of hardball questions, but I'd love to open it up to the group if anybody has any questions for Tony while we have him. Okay, I'll let things percolate. Oh, I see. Leo, you have your hand up. Go ahead.
Hi. Yeah. I was just because I was looking at through your argument and on parking mandates, but but my question is, what's your vision on how transit fits into this picture? Because there's transit and transit. Recently, the other day, I was in East Bay, and there's BART.
Yeah.
And the lines of where BART goes is often right in the middle of a highway.
Yeah.
But then if you look at a tram in a city, then it's used to break up the environment in a more organic way.
Mm-hmm.
So
Go ahead.
So my question is around this. How do you see using transit to reshape a neighborhood?
I think clearly transit, I prefer it personally. And I think it is the way that we get around in a way that is climate friendly and safer and provides more access and is more equitable. Um, so I mean, I think that's almost, but it's not, that's not, I'm not a transit planner, so to speak. I would say that what I do know is that parking requirements are, oppositional to not driving, right? So any mode of transportation that is not a private vehicle, um, is harmed by continuing the status quo of maintaining parking mandates and not managing our curbs. So it's like a barrier. I often say like getting rid of your parking mandates and doing these parking reforms is like if you want to have a garden in your yard, you're just removing the grass and the rocks, right? Like that doesn't you can't. I mean, obviously you can't go throw flowers and vegetable seed on a lawn and expect a garden to grow. You also, once you remove that the barrier to those things growing, it doesn't grow them. You still need to tend the garden. You need to plant things you want. You need so I that's adding the transit, doing the parking management, rezoning for upzoning. Those are all keys to kind of building the city that you want. But you're not going to be able to get there, or it's going to be very difficult to make good transit work if you're requiring parking all the time. And the other thing is one of the arguments is often, well, we can, we'll allow someone to build a not auto oriented apartment, for example, if the transit's there. But that's kind of backwards, right? Because you're requiring service and installation of transit. Why do you want to run a bus line somewhere where there's not any homes already and then upzone and then hope that 10 years later there's some homes there, or 5 years later there's some homes there? So I think like the key is get rid of the rules. They're hurting everything, and then kind of let things happen organically.
One thing thanks for your question, Leo. One thing I really just kind of want to touch on for people obviously familiar with Marin here. Marin's interesting because Southern Marin is all, 1890s, 1910s development, like very pre-car. And you showed some of the downtowns in Mill Valley and San Anselmo that are all very, very like, very dense. And, and you, like you point out, the parking requirements we now have, like, wouldn't have allowed those places, those places that people flock to have been built in the first place. Whereas Northern Marin, kind of Terra Linda and Novato is all kind of 1960s post parking requirements. And kind of that, obviously the downtown of Novato is very nice, but we still see the big difference in those, the kind of the built form. A couple of things, just I wanted to, ask a question for advocates. Obviously there's parking mandates, which cover off-street parking, and then there's curb management, which covers on-street parking. In the bike and walking advocacy space, obviously there's a lot. The off-street parking really matters a lot, but the fights that we're often involved with kind of involve that on-street parking, and oftentimes, to put in a protected bike lane, we would be losing some parking. I would say just like, from your experience in messaging this to skeptical members of the public, people in the Chamber of Commerce, people in the City Council, what language would you be using to kind of like to try to address those concerns? Again, like it isn't always in even places that are overparked, but so like even losing theoretical spots is something that people push back on. What would your advice be on that?
Right. Yeah, we obviously see this all over the place. Removing parking spaces on street it's very difficult. I think that one way you can work on this is to just, show how much parking there really is in communities. I think people just aren't aware of that. So that, I mean, it's not going to, any one of these things, I'll preface this by saying, a lot of organizing, a lot of advocacy is finding out, what resonates with individuals or individual groups and working on that. So the argument might be different depending on who you're talking to. And also not trying to argue too much with people who are completely opposed to you, but instead trying to find people who might be sympathetic with you and activate them. That said, I think you can show people, some things you can do is show people, really, how much parking there really is, or how much parking is unused. And like, are people parking in their driveways? So you might go down and see, yeah, people are parking on the street, but all their driveways are empty, and so you can point out, we can afford to lose this. I think also, and this, is that, we value like starting to manage on-street parking, like if the parking is so valuable for the residents that they don't want it to be a bike lane, then they should be paying for it, right? Like I think that's one of the arguments is like, well, if it's really worth something, then we should be charging for it. And you're not, sometimes parking is maybe the best current use for a curb space. And sometimes it's not, but it's very hard to determine what the best use is when we have this kind of valueless thing, right? Like, and I think that, so starting to say like, are you willing to pay for it? How much do you really care about it is one answer, but there's not an easy answer to, appeasing people when they lose their parking spaces, right? If you are doing comprehensive management where you're doing it based on demand, one benefit is if you remove parking on one street, that theoretically makes the parking more valuable everywhere else. And the nice thing about those parking benefit districts I mentioned is they usually are focused on returning parking revenue into the neighborhood community. So you can kind of make the argument that by reducing the available parking, you're generating more revenue to provide, better sidewalks, better lighting, better bus passes now. But that, it may not work for everybody.
Thanks, Tony. I'm gonna call my own number and ask kind of one more question, then we'll wrap up. This is a hard one though. What's the Parking Reform Network's policy on off-street bicycle parking?
Well, I'll say this. I think that some of the strongest arguments against parking mandates are that they're arbitrary numbers, right? And so for that reason, parking maximums we don't promote very much because it's just another number. I've gotten into this a little bit with John Bowders in Emeryville, Mayor Bowders, around this because I think, like, personally, I think it's, I understand as a person who doesn't have a car, how important it is to have a bicycle parking. But I think that that we should remember that we're predicting, right? These numbers in the zoning code are trying to predict something. So Portland had a pretty exciting bike parking code about 5-6 years ago, I think, and it totally missed the boat on cargo bikes and electric bikes, right? Like, and so it was like state of the art until it wasn't. And then they found that there was an architect that looked at how these bike rooms had to be laid out, and they actually took up a lot of space. So in my opinion, I think market solutions are great. I would like to see something that would say, the landlord has to find you parking if you're willing to, maybe pay a nominal amount for bike parking. I also think that curb spaces, using things like unipods, that allow on-street parking for bikes, and just we need more community parking for bikes. I think maybe even much more so than in apartment bike parking. So I'm long story short, I think it's hard to argue for a different number when you're spending your whole time saying these numbers are bad. But I do think
it's not a gotcha question. I actually wanted to know your opinion on this, and I thought this would be a good forum for that.
Sorry. Yeah. Yeah.
No, I just well, so Tony, I really just want to say thank you so much for joining us. One last question for people interested in learning more about the Parking Reform Network or becoming a member. What is the best way to do that? I think it was on your slide, but maybe you can repeat it.
We've got a website, parkingreform.org. We're on Blue Sky and Instagram. So I think those are the best ways. We've got resources there for you, and yeah, we're always happy to help in your community's reform efforts. So
wonderful. Well, Tony, thank you so much for joining us tonight. I really appreciate it. I hope it was as informative for everybody else as it was for me. And we wish you the best, and please keep up the great work over at the PRN.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Tony.